Welcome to Project-Based Learning for Elementary with Design for Learning. My name is Bradley Lands, and I am the author of the book Knowledge Able, owner of UpLearn LLC, and I'm currently the Director of Technology and Innovation at the Langley School in McLean, Virginia. Feel free to connect with me on social media with the following links. For a quick overview, we're going to first be discussing what is project-based learning. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive to explore the meaning of PBL and how you can use it in your classroom. Second, we're going to learn how we get started with PBL with an elementary focus. We will go through 4 specific steps of the process of project-based learning, where we will go into a little bit more detail about how you can use different tools, strategies, and resources to help you get started in PBL. And then finally, we're going to look at what PBL means for you at your school. We're going to ask you questions about how you can intentionally take this model using this framework and thinking about how you can implement it into your classroom at your school. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to be talking about a class that I currently teach called Inquiry Time. This is similar to something like you might have heard of, such as Genius Hour or the 20 Time Project. I currently teach this project to 3rd and 4th grade students at my school, and I'll be sharing some insight as to how I created this particular class and some different strategies that I use in order to help me make my students successful as they ask meaningful questions, embark on their learning journey, and then communicate their findings. So first, what is project-based learning? Project-based learning, or PBL, is a teaching method in which students learn by actively engaging in real-world and personally meaningful projects. I gained this information from pblworks.org/what-is-PBL. BIE, or the Buck Institute for Education, has some great resources on their website, pblworks.org, so I highly suggest that you check that out for more information. And after about 15 years of doing different project-based learning activities in the classroom, I created what I believe is one of the most successful project-based learning processes. I kind of take all the different resources, knowledge, and experience that I've gained over the years in doing project-based learning with different groups of students, and I really broke it down into a different process here that I'd like to share with you. First, I think it's important to ignite student curiosity. You first start out by presenting students with either a prompt, a problem, or a challenge to ignite their curiosity. This prompt could be a video, it could be an image, it could be a surprising statement, it could be an artifact that you bring in, something that relates to the topic that will really get them curious and asking questions. Then students work on driving a question or creating a driving question that will sustain their interest for the entire project. There are different strategies and tools that I'll talk about that will help students to first ask as many questions as they can think of, and then be able to slowly refine and make their questions more effective, and then finally prioritizing their questions and categorizing their questions so that they can really narrow down a driving question that will carry them through the project. Next, students engage in active research. They conduct active research in order to answer their driving question. This could be using the internet to try to look up answers to their questions. This could be exploring different resources like books, articles, journals. This could be doing hands-on learning by conducting their own science experiment. Lots of different ways in which they will do their own active research in order to answer their question or solve their problem. Next is documentation. We want students to document their learning by going through the process, and as the teacher, we help them to provide feedback to them as well as feedback from their peers. This is helpful so that we collect students' evidence of learning as we go along through the process. Then students create a product. This product will help to demonstrate their learning and understanding at the end of the project-based learning unit. And so this product can be lots of different things. It could be digital, it could be physical. It really depends on what the teacher's purpose is for their final project, and maybe allowing for student voice and choice. Then students will do the presentation stage, where they present their work and share their work with an authentic audience. It doesn't really matter what their product is that they create. It could be a video, it could be a skit, it could be a painting, it could be lots of different things. But it is important that they do present and share their work with an audience. Sometimes it could be the class, sometimes it could be greater than the class by inviting the community or even the school. Maybe it could be a gallery walk where students set up their own project and they allow for students, parents, and teachers to come around and walk through a classroom or a large space, and they can answer any questions that people might have. Or maybe they actually give a very professional presentation to a large group of students, the faculty, or even the community. It really depends on what you as a teacher would like your students to do. Then there's the assessment piece. Students are assessed on their learning, the product, and the process. I found a really good rubric that I'm going to share with you later on that might help you think about the entire project as a whole and thinking about how you might assess student learning throughout the process. And then finally, having students reflect on their learning as they receive constructive feedback, both from the teacher, them reflecting on their own project themselves, and also getting feedback from their peers. So, after hearing about this process of project-based learning, I'd like you to think about the following questions. As you reflect on the PBL process, what surprised you about the process that I shared with you? Is there anything that you learned or something that you maybe didn't consider before looking at that process? 2, in what area or areas might you need more support? By looking at that process, what are some areas that you think you would like to explore more? What are some areas that you think you might need to leverage more resources or people to help you be successful? And then finally, 3, what questions do you have about the process that I shared with you? What do you want to learn more about? Take some time to reflect on these questions before moving on to the next section. Part 2, how do I get started with project-based learning? Now that we know a little bit more about what project-based learning is, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on how we get started with the process. I like to think of this as a 4-step process that we can use, leveraging strategies, tools, and resources that are designed for you to implement in your classroom immediately. And so these are the 4 steps in the process that I think makes it a little bit more easy to understand and to be able to implement in the classroom. Number 1, commit to project-based learning. This is half the battle. A lot of teachers that haven't done this before can find it a little intimidating as there are a lot of unanswered questions. They're a little bit worried about making sure they cover all the material in the same amount of time. And so, really committing to the project is half the battle and the first step. So, being willing to take a learning risk. The second step is backwards planning. I find that the understanding by design or UBD framework is really important and effective at helping me to think about my students' end goal and then kind of working backwards from there. And so I'll share some different tips and resources that you can use to help you get through this. Number three is project logistics. This will help you to plan, organize, and structure your unit as you think about the specific grade levels that you're using, the specific subject matter that you're teaching, and what you want your students to get out of the experience. And then four, student deliverables. You're going to determine ahead of time what evidence of student learning that you would actually like to collect and think about how you're going to have different checkpoints throughout your project to make sure that you are collecting evidence of student learning and that you're giving them adequate feedback. And so the first thing I like to start with is asking yourself the following question. Do I know how to effectively do PBL? Yes, go ahead and do that. No, let's go ahead and find out in this presentation the resources that I share and connecting with other people so that we can have enough confidence to be able to take that first step of committing to PBL. And so two, let's take a look at backwards planning. We're going to look at the UBD framework and pieces of the UBD framework that will make it easier for you to think about the student's end goal and what you want them to learn and understand by the end of the project. And so I've adapted the UBD framework by thinking about the first part of backwards planning. It's important to think about the unit of study and the topic that you're going to be presenting to students. Maybe this is in a homeroom class where you teach all the different subjects. Thinking about what subject you want to focus on, or if you want to make this an interdisciplinary project where you have all the different subjects kind of intersect into a meaningful project. Or it could be an isolated class. Maybe you're a fifth grade science teacher or a fifth grade social studies teacher, and you want to find something specific in your curriculum for students to explore more. For example, in my fourth grade inquiry time class, our students were currently learning about how water can be used in different communities. So I asked them to think about all the questions that they could come up with on the topic of water. Then I put them in different groups, and their groups naturally formed different driving questions that would allow them to think about water in different capacities, such as how do different communities purify water? Or how is water used to impact the economy? After you identify the unit of study, you're going to think about the desired learning outcomes. These are going to be your student objectives of their learning outcomes. And you're going to help to create the design learning outcomes or the desired learning outcomes by using the state and national standards. These could be any standards that you currently use in your class or in your school to help you to be able to find out what's important for students to learn at this particular grade level in this subject area. And so by referencing and documenting the state and national standards, they will help you to be able to create student learning objectives that you'll be able to use for this project. 3, project logistics. Plan, organize, and structure. These are just different topics and ideas that will help you to really think through the details of your entire project. And so here are some examples. The first is going to be your assessment of the student presentation and project. This is the Science Leadership Academy rubric that I have found and have been adapting for quite some time now. I think it provides a really effective framework for you to think about how students might be able to exceed your expectations, and then also making sure you have opportunities to share how they meet, approach, or maybe even doesn't meet expectations. And you can think about the entire project in terms of design, knowledge, application, their presentation, and the process. And so I found this rubric to be really helpful, and I've even adapted it in places where I think it might be more relevant to the particular grade level or subject that I'm teaching. Next is thinking about your scope and sequence. Trying to think about your timeline and how much time you have allotted for this particular unit of study can be helpful. And referencing where you are in your curriculum is also going to be really helpful to help you think about the different topics, state national standards, and student objectives that you want to complete throughout this unit. You can also think about how much structure you want to provide to your students throughout your unit. This is a helpful graphic that will allow you to think about how much student agency you like to provide that goes along with student inquiry. There are four different types of inquiry, such as free inquiry, guided inquiry, controlled inquiry, and structured inquiry. In the beginning of the year, I like to start off with structured inquiry so that I can help coach my students and model for my students different expectations as they move throughout the unit. And then, as I get a little bit more comfortable and more confident in the process, I slowly let go of some control and provide them with more agency. And so, this is a helpful guide to determine how much structure you want to give to your students as you complete your project. And the last thing to consider is your student groupings. Do you want your students to work independently? Do you want them to work in pairs? Or do you want them to work in small groups? If you have your students work in small groups, I suggest having each student play a different role in the group so that each student has some accountability and contributes to a different part of the project. In my projects, I like to have my students be the manager, the designer, the builder, and the reporter. This allows each student to contribute differently to the group and having everyone be accountable for a different part. Finally, student deliverables. Think about different checkpoints throughout the process where you can stop and assess student learning, give them feedback, and have them be able to reflect on their learning. And so these are four parts within student deliverables that I think are really helpful. One is giving them feedback and assessing their driving question. This is arguably the most important part, as we really want to help students become better learners by learning how to ask better questions, thinking about how they can refine their questions, make their questions stronger, use different vocabulary, or even combine multiple questions into one so that they can get really targeted results. Then I like to actually have students create a project proposal. Depending on how old the students are, this project proposal can look a little bit different. I think it's effective whether students are working in groups or if they're working individually for them to share a project proposal with the teacher that helps them think through the process. Having them state their driving question, having them think about different resources and materials that they're going to be using or they would like to try to use, having them think about how they want to share their knowledge that they gained, and what type of format do they want to use. Do they want to create a typical presentation? Do they want to create a video? Do they want to create a children's book? There are lots of different options that students can use. And then finally, having them be able to pitch the idea to the class or to a small group of students can be really fun. I like the pitch part because it gets a little bit into business model and how the real world works. And so having them do a quick pitch to share their idea with the class, I think is a really fun part of this process. And then finally, you have multiple checkpoints throughout, making sure that students get a chance to really reflect at different stages throughout their learning and be able to have meaningful conversation with their peers and the teachers. Scheduling little mini conferences with students throughout this time can be really helpful. And then as I went in the project proposal a little bit, thinking about their final presentation. Again, this is a little bit different from the product or the artifact they create. That could be something different, like a video project, like we said, or it could be, a children's book, it could be a podcast, right? That's the product or artifact. Their final presentation is them thinking about how they're going to actually effectively communicate their product and their findings to an authentic audience. And so these are four things that I think are really helpful to think about when creating your own project-based learning unit and then getting students to think about different parts of the process that they will need to be able to accomplish. Okay, so here's your second task. After learning a little bit more about this four-step process, start thinking about a project-based learning unit using backwards planning. If you were to create a new PBL unit for your students, I'd like you to go ahead and think about what that topic would be for the unit of study, and then begin looking at the different standards and objectives that you want your students to master. After you have that, Determine the performance assessment that students will use to demonstrate their learning and understanding. And then finally, consider other student deliverables that you can use to evaluate student growth and learning. Is this going to be a mini conference? Is this going to be maybe a Google form that students can submit to help them reflect on the process? Is this going to be peer feedback when students are talking in groups? So take this time to think about these different questions and how you might be able to start planning the logistics and the details of your project. In part 3, what does project-based learning mean for you in your classroom? Given the information that we've talked about, how might you adopt or adapt the different four-step process and the different deliverables that your students will do? As you reflect on the information that has been shared in this presentation, think about how you can use these steps to implement your own project-based learning unit. Thinking about the prompt. In this photo, you can see that the teacher is actually using an artifact to engage students and get them thinking about the topic. They're getting curious. They're writing down their questions. They're writing down their observations. And again, different strategies could be using an artifact or a product like this, or it could be posing a surprising statement, showing students an image, or even a video. What materials and resources and consumables or instruments will you allow your students to use for this project? Will it be open-ended? Will you provide some constraints that might even be relevant to the topic? Think about what materials and resources you have in your classroom and what other resources students might need that you might be able to provide for them. Will they be allowed to bring in things from the outside, or will it be confined to the materials that are in the classroom? Think about the digital learning tools that you'll be able to use, and think about which ones your students might want to leverage for their project. Are your students using iPads? Do they use tablets? Do they use Chromebooks or other computers? Think about the tools that are available at your school, and think about some of the different tools that your students have already used so far and that they are familiar with so that they can begin using those different applications to apply to their project. Think about how you want your students to be grouped. Do you want your students to work independently? Do you want them to work in small pairs? Or do you want them to work in small groups? Sometimes it can be meaningful to have students work individually, and sometimes it can be purposeful to have students work in groups. but it's important to think of this ahead of time so that you can begin planning the appropriate details and support that your students might need, depending on your choice. And then the presentation. How do you want your students to present the information? Is this going to be more formal to an authentic audience? Are you going to invite outside experts or community members? Or are you going to have your students present to the class? Thinking about creating a stage for your students can be really important so that it makes it more meaningful and impactful to your students' learning. Think about the presentation that you want your students to be able to do, and think about the time and space that you will allow your students to be able to use in order to do their presentation. Here's your third task. After thinking about all the information that's been shared, thinking about the project-based learning process, thinking about breaking those items down into the 4-step process that I shared, then having you think about how you might be able to implement these ideas into your own classroom. What will your PBL unit look like in your classroom? First, think about a prompt or a scenario that you might use to hook your students. What tools, materials, and resources will you provide to your students? And how might you structure and organize your project-based learning unit for your students? Take this time to really think about these details to help you plan out the logistics of your project-based learning unit. Here are some resources to help support you in your learning journey. There are different blog posts that have been provided by Design for Learning that I've helped to write and create. And there are also a couple other resources that I think are helpful to support students in their research process, such as 8 questions to help students identify credible resources, and then thinking about how you can use technology in meaningful ways to help create a culture of academic integrity. I also encourage you to check out my book, Knowledge Able: Igniting a New Generation of Lifelong Learners. In this book, I share lots of different information, tips, and strategies that really unpack the concepts that are in this lesson. You'll learn a lot more about specific project-based learning activities and projects that I've done with my students. You'll also learn a little bit more about how to help students come up with a driving question. And you'll also learn a lot more support and resources for students at different age groups as they use inquiry and different technology tools to help them become better learners. Again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time here. Feel free to check out my resources that I posted, and also feel free to connect with me on social media. Thank you so much, and I hope you've learned a lot from this lesson today.